Hello and welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us on this Monday evening to hear about a great new book that my friend and colleague, Dr. Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens, has co-authored with some of his former colleagues from George Washington University, and specifically the program on extremism, which is an academic research center based there. I should say this event is hosted by ICSR, the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, which is itself an academic research center based within the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I'm Dr. Shiraz Maher, and I'm the director of that center and also a lecturer within the department. And Alex, before I hand over to you, just it's worth saying Alex's previous book, Incitement, which is about Anwar al-Awlaki, is shortlisted for the Eredive Prize tomorrow, so I'm sure you'll all join me in wishing him best of luck, which he should be hearing about the fortunes of that, as I say, in just over 24 hours' time. So good luck with that, Alex, and we wish you well, of course, with that. So you guys have taken quite a sort of unique approach with this book, which is looking at ISIS in the United States and sort of really drilling down into that scene in the US. Why did you take that approach, and what's the sort of thesis of the book in relation to that?
Yeah, so part of the book was inspired in terms of the way it looks and the way we've organized it by work that's been done in Europe on sort of mapping jihadist networks, particularly that by Peter Nesser, whose work I know you're very familiar with, and his book in particular, I think Al-Qaeda in Europe or jihadism in Europe, was an excellent overview of how it operate, of how the movements operate there and recruit and spread their propaganda. But we thought this hadn't really been done in the US. And we also kind of noticed that one of the key things that we know about jihadist recruitment and activism in Europe is it's largely driven by longstanding, deep-rooted recruitment networks that have existed really for a couple decades in some cases, in UK, in France, in the Netherlands, Belgium, places that have had longstanding, deep-rooted networks. The US doesn't really have that. And yet it still had a problem with jihadism, and particularly after 2014 with ISIS. So we thought the US, in terms of Western democracies, was a kind of unique opportunity to do a case study on a country that didn't have the conditions that we've come to expect or are key for driving jihadist activism. So that was kind of one of the main reasons we went with the kind of US focus. And, you know, the other thing to keep in mind, just in terms of research, I lived in Washington, D.C. For a couple of years between 2016 and 2018, where I did a lot of this research with my two colleagues, Seamus Hughes and Bennett Clifford. We were all working together at the program on extremism at George Washington University. I worked there in-house for 2 years. I still work for them, but as non-resident. And, you know, one of the things that struck me very early on doing this work in the US is just how open the government system is there as far as access to information, court records in particular. And so you also just have this unique access to primary sources that is way, way harder to get in Europe. And, you know, if you talk to, you'll know as well, talking to journalists who cover terrorism in the UK, you know, in order for them to know what's going on in a court, they have to be in the courtroom in order to get the transcripts, in order to maybe write the transcripts themselves. It's very hard to get access as a member of the public to court proceedings and to the evidence and to the transcripts. Almost impossible, actually, unless you were in the courtroom. Even the journalists have a problem with that here. The US is simply not like that. It is a public open system. It's not a great system, but it's nonetheless an open one where you can really access so much in terms of primary source material. So it was also just a treasure trove of data that we were able to draw on, and it's a uniquely open country like the United States in terms of, you know, allowing its citizens to see the justice process kind of play out as openly as possible. And that was a huge advantage, I would say.
And yeah, you mentioned that work there. I mean, Seamus has done a lot of stuff in and around some of those, what you call the PACER documents. Do you want to just explain to people, I suppose, some of the, without giving away all the sort of tradecraft, how you've mined PACER to sort of inform the sort of findings of the book? Yeah,
I mean, Seamus Hughes, director of the program, is the kind of, he's the PACER whisperer. So he's the perfect guy to talk to. But PACER essentially is the acronym for this system, online system that the US courts have, where you can, if you pay for it, you can access, in theory, any court document that hasn't been, specifically sealed to the public, which is fairly rare. And Seamus essentially became the guy who figured out how to use it in the most effective way. And that's kind of where it began, with his digging and some direction from us and others. And that was kind of very important. And also then figuring out how to get documents that weren't being made publicly available, how to get them publicly available. And that included making representations to have documents unsealed. So asking courts and judges to unseal documents and that we believed had been sort of unjustifiably held back from the public. So we managed to get documents unsealed. And then, of course, freedom of information requests, where from even the court documents, it allowed us to inform, create very informed FOI requests that, again, sort of unlocked a lot of information for us. And again, so the nature of the federal system there it's complicated, but it's doable in a way that, at least in the UK, it's almost not, I would say.
And so those PACER documents, like you were saying, were helping you illuminate some of the darker parts of that ISIS network within the US. You mentioned Peter Nesser and some of the work he's done looking at Europe. I suppose my question is, what are the differences you found, and why do you think those differences are there between what was happening in the US and Europe?
Yeah, so the key difference is, lack of historic recruitment networks. So that kind of means that the picture of jihadist and ISIS mobilization in the United States is a much more scattered one than you'd get in Europe. So in Britain and in a lot of European countries, if you were to create a map with hotspots of activity and arrests, they usually kind of form hotspots around the country that are kind of become recognized as for a variety of reasons, the places where people kind of are more likely to be radicalized and to mobilize. That just is not the case in the US. They don't really have this hotspots phenomenon, apart from in one or two very rare cases. So Minnesota, for a number of specific reasons, that's considered a sort of hub of ISIS recruitment. But other than that, a very scattered picture. And essentially what we got to see was, how does a group like ISIS, how does a foreign terrorist group, in this case ISIS, maintain a presence in a country where it really has almost no on the ground access or routes? Is it possible? Clearly it is. Something like, at the moment, we're around 220, just under, Americans who've been charged and or convicted since 2014 on ISIS-related offenses. And so it's still going on, but the fact that these networks don't exist partly help us understand why it's less of a, in terms of proportional to the population, it's still a very small issue compared to Europe and the US, but it's still there. And they've had a number of, fairly notorious deadly attacks. So, that was quite an important difference. And essentially what we've seen is, ISIS emerged really at the moment when people were turning to social media in huge numbers. Just in terms of timing, that's when the regular user numbers for Twitter and Facebook, and that's when they really started shooting up. And the sort of near the beginning of the last decade, so 2011, 2012, 13, and as ISIS started emerging, 14, it was really the moment so many people, they had more eyes, available to them they could access. And in general, what we've seen is, despite all the lack of in-person access to Americans, they've managed to use the internet probably about as effectively as they could have to get people to act in various ways. And we have an entire chapter on the different kind of uses of modern communications technology that ISIS use. And beyond that, a surprising amount still wanting to travel to join ISIS. Something of around 30% of all the arrests were people who tried or attempted to join ISIS, and about the same percentage planned attacks at home as well. So I don't know how that compares actually to the European numbers, if it's a different balance, but that was how it looks in the US anyway.
Yeah, and actually I was going to follow up on that, but before I do, it's worth saying people are sort of putting questions in already to the Q&A box, so please do feel free. Don't wait until the end or until I explicitly ask for them. If you want to send through questions and just populate that field for us, I'll then turn to Alex with those, as needed. But you mentioned, obviously, the focus on ISIS. We all know, of course, Al-Qaeda is still around. It's continued to pull off attacks. It's continuing in its own ways to inspire recruits. You only need to think back to the Boston bombings as well, which happened, I think, before ISIS certainly reached its high watermark, but nonetheless, the Syrian conflict was raging and people were turning their attention to Syria at that time. So why have you chosen to focus on ISIS specifically and not jihadism in America, for example?
Yeah, and that was the first issue we came across when we were developing the book, was how do we, do we make this just about ISIS? If so, how do we justify that? Why don't we just go with, because we also acknowledge that, particularly for Americans and Westerners, the division between Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all these other factions that are very, pronounced in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, those differences don't matter as much to Westerners, right? They're not as obsessed about whether is it Al-Qaeda, is it ISIS that I'm a member of. So that division isn't that important to them. And so initially we thought, how do we justify this? And we even see cases of individuals who, in their manifestos or in their, in their wills they leave behind, they'll mention, bin Laden and then Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. They don't mind, they'll take inspiration from all around. But nonetheless, we decided there was still a justification for ISIS, and that was mainly because of it. Two reasons, but mostly the kind of unique success that it has had. So since 9/11, data on charged, Americans charged for jihadist related terrorism offenses. Since 9/11, New America Foundation puts that number at somewhere 440, 450 in total, right, since 9/11 to today. Over half of those, though, happened since 2014. So, and are ISIS related. So the speed of the and the sort of those accumulation of ISIS numbers was, really pointed to us, at least, or suggested to us, that ISIS has been much more successful for whatever reason at attracting Americans in a quicker amount of time, and not to mention the amount of Americans that it were convinced to travel abroad. That number is nearly 300. Now that's not including people who charged. No, that's just the full, estimated number is near 300 Americans. Nothing, Al-Qaeda never got close to getting that number of Americans to leave home and join. The only, any group that even comes close is Al-Shabaab, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, that for a period was the go-to kind of destination and battlefield for Western jihadists. But ISIS so quickly overtook that. So we thought the success of ISIS compared to Al-Qaeda kind of made it something that was worth focusing on specifically, even though in the book there are cases that we look at that where there's a slightly less clear connection, if is it ISIS or is it, say, Jabhat al-Nusra? And in fact, one of the big questions we get, and this is another question about compared to Europe, is in terms of returnees, what does the threat look like, right? People who've joined and come back. In the US, it's something around 20 to 30 who've come back, almost all of whom were known about from the moment they returned. So not like in Europe where we had masses of people come back, in some cases slipping through the net and not really knowing where they were. The US had kept a fairly good eye on that. But the only person, and almost none of them have come back with any plan to carry out an attack, except for one. And he was actually sent by Jabhat al-Nusra, not by Al-Qaeda, not by ISIS. So that was interesting. But just to go back, so the second reason why we focused on ISIS was also just because of the unique nature of its presence. That it had set up this state, and it was kind of doing things that Al-Qaeda hadn't really managed to do as far as attracting Westerners. So we just thought, even though someone could probably still argue that we should include them all, we thought a narrower focus on ISIS kind of gave this book a more of a unique kind of element to it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that chimes with some of the work that we've done at ICSR previously as well, which was just the unique manner in which ISIS was able to mobilize people all over the world compared to anything that had come before, even Al-Qaeda with something like the 9/11 attacks as a sort of emblematic sort of figurehead of what they were able to achieve. It still didn't translate in quite the same way to recruitment and sort of, I suppose, volunteers on the ground in the way that ISIS was able to. To that extent, I wanted to ask you some broader observation that you might have seen or you may not have seen, which was, I think it's clear that whilst Al-Qaeda was waging a broader campaign against the West as a whole, the United States sort of occupied a unique position of enmity for them. 9/11 obviously being, as I said, this large-scale attack, but there were constant references to Bush, to the war on terror, and to those kinds of things. And of course, Britain and countries like Spain and France and others did feature in Al-Qaeda propaganda, France more so over cartoons controversy in recent years. But did you get the sense that America held this kind of unique position for ISIS as well, or was ISIS more generally focused on other countries?
Yeah, interesting. I think ISIS were acting, in terms of their international terrorist, aims and strategy. I think they were essentially going for the most realistic targets. And the truth is, I think still my impression is, looking at American ISIS members' communication with, people in Raqqa and actual members of ISIS, it did seem that the U.S. was still viewed as the holy grail as far as carrying out attacks. But they knew realistically that the reach was, much weaker. As I said, the ability to send an American back to the U.S. without them being noticed, almost impossible. So it's just a much more difficult target. But because of that, I would say they would still prefer an attack right in the U.S. homeland. It's the most difficult Western target, I would argue, and it would be even more of a celebration for them. But as I think you've noticed, particularly with France, what's happening there and the current kind of upheaval with a couple of attacks that have happened there, it's easy for another target to emerge. But overall, my impression has been that in fact, we've seen a lot of cases of Americans who been in touch with recruiters in Syria, wanting to go and travel, desperate to go and travel and join the group, and being told that actually you're far more valuable to us in the United States than you are here. You being able to carry an attack in America means much more to us than your ability to come and fight, ineffectively on the front lines for us. And certainly, especially as the state started disintegrating, that became almost the instruction was, forget about coming here, stay there. And so the statistics about, that divide the charges of ISIS, the ISIS related charges in the US, those planning attacks compared to those planning to travel has steadily risen in terms of the breakdown. More, we're seeing more people planning attacks since, over the last couple of years. And that number, kind of the gap between planned travel and planned attack, minimizing or getting smaller. But interestingly, in general, especially right at the beginning, the main desire from ISIS supporters in the US was to leave and join and live there. That was the key kind of motivation. It wasn't carrying out attacks at home. But that has kind of slowly turned around as the years have worn on.
So there's a chapter in the book where you look at the various plots, right? And, what's come out of that. I think, again, when we look at ISIS in Europe, using the French example, even sort of, I suppose, despite the ISIS-Al-Qaeda rivalry that was taking place on the ground inside Syria, when you had the Charlie Hebdo attack ostensibly done in the name of Al-Qaeda, even ISIS had to be seen to applaud that, right? Because it was sort of, in inverted commas, avenging the prophet, right? And even they couldn't be seen to be putting a kind of, we might call partisan difference between themselves and AQ into that consideration. But obviously there were a number of attacks in the US that were attributed back to ISIS. Was there one or a couple or a particular type that stood out in particular to the group that so not necessarily from the US law enforcement perspective, but from the group's perspective, that they particularly liked or thought was a good example of what they'd like to achieve?
Well, the most notorious attacks definitely are Omar Matin's shooting of the Pulse, attack on the Pulse nightclub. And I think, that because of the nature of the target, initially there was a lot of questions about whether this should be really considered, an ISIS-related attack. Was that, there was a gay club that he attacked, and this was seen possibly more as a sort of hate crime or homophobic sort of motivation behind it. But one of the things we demonstrate in the book is actually, my team absolutely acting on behalf of ISIS, and in fact even in touch with ISIS members, on the day of the attack itself. Certainly that one stuck out mostly because of its success in inverted commas, in terms of the casualty numbers, and then of course is the San Bernardino shooting in California with Tashin Malik and her husband, whose name has just escaped me. Killed 14 people again, these were shooting type of attacks. And of course, one of the things to keep in mind in the US, one of the preferred methods of ISIS attack in the West is these kind of what used to be called, I suppose not really anymore, Mumbai style attacks with assault rifles. Of course, in the United States, accessing those kind of weapons is much easier than in Europe. And certainly a lot of the plots have looked like that in terms of someone getting hold of a gun. But actually, the fact that it's so easy to get hold of an assault rifle in the US, and yet there's still a relatively low amount of those kind of attacks, jihadi-inspired ones at least, mass shootings in the US, does kind of suggest that it's still a relatively small threat. If not, it's an interesting one, but not necessarily a huge one. So those are the two ones that, of course, ISIS most likely, we're most pleased with, or certainly a lot of their propaganda output was focused on it. Another thing to keep in mind, we mentioned the kind of Mohammed cartoons issue, particularly in France. That one thing that's very interesting is at least, I think, 6, if not 7 different plots that were foiled eventually were inspired by or were targeting people who were involved with drawing cartoons of Muhammad or promoting cartoons of Muhammad. So it's an issue in the United States as well. And in fact, if you were to say what's the one most popular target in the United States among ISIS supporters, one of the main ones is those people who are seen to be insulting Islam or Muhammad. So that's quite an interesting development in the sense that we think of it maybe as a more of a European issue, French issue even. In fact, a number of people in the US were directed, by the way, by ISIS centrally in Raqqa and other parts of Syria, directed to focus on those kind of targets. So it has been, and in fact, we even know in Texas, there was an attempted attack. Elton Simpson and Nadir Sufi tried to attack a convention center in Texas that was holding a Draw Muhammad cartoon day, a sort of a deliberate sort of attempt to target and get a rise out of Muslims, and run, of course, by these fairly well-known sort of anti-Muslim activists. And that became a very obvious target, and in fact, attack very nearly took place there. So I would say those are a couple of things to keep in mind. In terms of plot, things that stuck out to us in our research. So as well as the court documents I mentioned in terms of the primary data we used, the court documents, something like 20,000+ pages of court documents, probably formed the backbone of a lot of the research. But there's a lot of other things that we did, and including interviewing a number of different FBI field agents who were directly involved with major ISIS investigations, and we go through some of our discussions with them. And there was one that stuck out just because of kind of this relatively surreal nature of how it went down, and that was a American, I think parents from Sierra Leone, but American citizen called Mohammed Baylor Jallo, who did a number of things, but his main, he initially traveled to Sierra Leone and Nigeria, and then tried to get to join ISIS in Libya, changes his mind sort of halfway in the journey, goes back to the US, but goes back to the US with ISIS connections, remains in touch with a couple of known operatives that were being monitored by the FBI. And it soon became clear that he was thinking of an attack in the US. And there was a couple of things that made him very concerning to the authorities. And one was that he was a former military US Army reservist. So he'd had military training. And he'd actually begun speaking to someone who later on turned out to be an informant, telling them that he'd been inspired quite a bit by Major Nidal Hassan's attack, which was an Al-Qaeda-inspired shooting of a US Army base in these sort of, let's say, Al-Qaeda years in the US. And he wanted to carry out a similar type of attack, and he was being watched at that point. Now he'd been watched almost pretty much around the clock by the FBI. He was working as a security guard, very diligent worker. He was always on time. He was always doing his hours, so it was actually quite easy to track. But then he would make certain journeys that raised flags, and one of the journeys that raised a flag was his trip to a gun shop in Virginia, where he started having a look at the notorious AR-15 rifle, and was planning on buying it that day. Left the store, according to the FBI people tracking him, without the gun. And they go into the store afterwards, in the morning, actually, the next morning, FBI goes into the store and starts quizzing the salesman about this individual who'd been in the store before, the day before. What did he want? Why didn't he buy the gun? Apparently he needed some paperwork together to buy the gun, and he was going to come back that same day. The store clerk starts realizing, that these are probably federal agents asking a bunch of questions about this guy who's come in trying to buy a gun, and he said something like to them, don't tell me this guy's a terrorist, or don't tell me he's an ISIS supporter. And the agents weren't really allowed to say much, but they didn't answer, and he immediately responded, according to them, with "oh shit," and in fact they told him, this guy's going to come back to the store. We're going to give you an AR-15 that's been decommissioned, that won't work, and you're going to sell it to him. And this is what happened. So essentially this member of the public all of a sudden finds himself half enlisted in this investigation. They say, just get on with your job, act as everything's normal. You just need him to go in, buy the gun, and leave. And apparently, not with the one he bought, but he'd even done some target practice in the range in the back of the shop. So you can imagine how nervous the staff would have been there. So that story stuck out mostly because of that. In the end, it looked like he was planning a mass shooting on on July 4th, back in 2016, I think it was. And he bought the gun, and the next day he was leaving his house, seemingly in preparation for the attack, and was arrested. And they looked at his browser history and everything else, and it was all questions about, what's the most effective, what's the best target on July 4th? How did Omar Mateen carry out his attack? And it was clear that this guy was planning and fairly serious about carrying out a mass shooting in the US. And that's one of a number of stories that we kind of go into detail. So we try to also give this side of the sort of what do the investigations look like? And we also get into a lot of detail about the legalistic, the legal approaches, the specific statutes that are used in the US. And again, one of the other differences, actually, you were asking about differences with Europe, is the legislation the United States had when ISIS emerged was actually very robust when it came to people trying to join foreign or any terrorist group. So whereas in Europe, we had, you knew before almost anyone else, when you were looking at Brits leaving and going to join ISIS, we had this issue of, we basically, we knew they were going to go join a jihadist group. The authorities knew, but they simply couldn't stop them, right? There's nothing that could be done to stop those individuals. There was no law in place. And you had, I think I'm right in saying, right, you had a lot of people going over, and we kind of knew what they were doing, but nothing could be done. And we've since developed legislation in the UK about that, right? I think we've criminalized travel to certain specific identified regions and areas that the Foreign Office says, if you go here, you've broken the law. It's kind of the best that they've been able to do. But the US had pre-existing statutes, particularly the material support statute, which essentially says that if you can be proven that you intended to provide material support to a recognized terrorist group, and that material support included not just sending money and weapons, but yourself. So even if you tried to go join a group, that counts as breaking the material support statute. And so there was already law in place in the United States to stop people from leaving and arresting them before they went and putting them in prison. They're not getting huge sentences because the nature of the crime is that we know it was the intent. They're getting in the region of 10 to 13 years on average, something like that. Yeah, so that was kind of off on a tangent slightly, but just another interesting difference in the kind of the tools that the United States has at its disposal kind of made it, right off the bat, a more difficult place to really do much as far as if you were a jihadist wanting to pursue the aims of ISIS in particular.
Yeah, I mean, given that you started talking about the legal, there's two sort of broader areas that we can touch on before going to questions. But let's do the legal side now then. You mentioned earlier at the start, and I know it's an ongoing topic of debate about returnees. In fact, in the UK today, Shamima Begum's case has now started at the Supreme Court about the prospect of her returning to fight her deprivation of citizenship issue. Talk us through a little bit of that legislative landscape in the US, particularly in terms of how the US is using that with regards to returnees and that whole issue, which it does seem like the US has a slightly more progressive approach on this than Europe, which hasn't always actually been the case in the war on terror years. So, you know, what is it doing, and why do you think the US is sort of acting better in this case?
So the main thing, other than a couple of high-profile cases, is they're not stripping they're not stripping Americans of their citizenship, and almost always they are taking them back, and rather than leaving them in the camps. There's a couple of exceptions. The most well-known, probably the Hoda Mutana case, where that became quite a well-known one because she was stripped of her citizenship, but there was a unique situation there with how she gained her citizenship in the first place. Had to do with her father's diplomatic presence in the U.S. and I think, you know, it gave them more, but it may well simply have been a case of this was a case that became well known. She was, you know, giving interviews. She was kind of goading the United States, and they seem to have responded pretty much by stripping over citizenship because of the sort of public nature of it. It seemed maybe a face-saving exercise, maybe. But on the whole, they are having them come back, children coming back as well, without much controversy. And you know why? I think the most, it's the most reasonable thing. And some people like you and others have been arguing the same thing, that it's the response that makes the most sense. One, you're not outsourcing your security to a camp in the middle of the desert somewhere that could at any moment go south, more south than they're already going. You're not outsourcing your security to sort of militias that are running these camps. You are providing support for the victims of it, in many cases the children of these people who've made these terrible decisions. And the other key thing that I've mentioned is the United States has the legislation in place to properly try these individuals, even if because one of the problems Europe has is even now people coming back, and just what will we do? I think one of these conundrums that you have in the UK is the fear that, okay, let's have them come back, but then what if we can't charge them? What if we can't convict them? Then we're bringing back all these people that we can't. The US is far more robust legislation that, as I've mentioned, particularly material support, that's where almost all of them go down on, is on that particular component of the law. So I think the structures in place are stronger to make sure that you're not having people come back in that you may then have to cut loose, and just creating a huge problem for your security services. So there is just that practical thing as well. They can do it, whereas legislation in Europe just is not as trustworthy, frankly, in terms of getting a result. And so I can understand, some of those reasons why it's more complicated in Europe to bring people back, even though overall I think it's a bad policy.
So I was going to ask you, how well equipped do you think the US is to deal with the next ISIS plot? I don't know if that's your answer to it already, but there does seem to be a sort of better understanding now in terms of the nature of this group, the nature of terrorist recruitment, and the nature of how groups like ISIS are reaching out to diaspora communities in the US, elsewhere. Do you think the US you mentioned you've interviewed FBI and various other members of the intelligence community there. Do you think they're better placed now to stop those next attacks?
Yeah, and I think partly things I already mentioned, the legislation, their experience now, but also it's one of the key tactics the FBI uses that we talk about, of course, is the sting operations, and we even have percentages on how many cases, how many of those charged, or what percentage involved some kind of informant, undercover agent. Of the 217 now that have been charged in the US on ISIS-related charges, it's something like 58 to 60% involve some kind of informant. And that's, it's a controversial part of the American, ISIS story, because people like to compare or use terms like entrapment to suggest that the FBI is kind of egging people on to do this stuff. And in fact, we've seen similar stings done with recently with militia members of the United States that plot to assassinate or kidnap was she a senator or congresswoman? The militia plot to do that was uncovered by an FBI sting. So it's not something that's only being used against jihadists, but it's a classic FBI and U.S. law enforcement tactic. The criticism, of course, of that is, would these individuals have done this had the FBI not, say, provided them seeming opportunities? And one, it's a counterfactual. We couldn't be sure, but what we do know is that plenty of attacks have taken place, plenty of plots have gone ahead and have been stopped right at the last minute or out of luck. So we do know that there is an intent among ISIS supporters to do this. This has happened. So it's not as if we're having a sort of manufactured problem here. It has happened in the past. So I think it's largely justified. The hoops they have to jump through in order to get authorization to do these operations are significant. The judge's orders, the permission, the paperwork is a huge part of it. So having seen it from behind the scenes, I'm not saying it's a perfect system. I'm sure people do often, it may get caught up and unlucky with this stuff sometimes. But overall, and it has been effective. It's dealing with a real threat. And also, it's a bit of a misconception that it's unique to the American approach. There have been a number of cases that we know of in the UK and in Europe where stings have been used. The reason, and it could well be, again, the reason we know so much about what the FBI is doing and how they're doing it is because of that openness that I've mentioned to you before. Can you imagine in the UK getting to sit down and have an on-the-record interview with MI5 agents who tracked ISIS members in the UK? I mean, could you even imagine that being possible for a book? Almost unheard of. We were able to speak to multiple FBI teams in open conversations. Yes, we don't name them, but we have quotes. It's on the record. And so it's just the fact that we know that because the United States is relatively open, its justice system is relatively open, we know that they're using stings a lot. In the UK and Europe, it's every so often you hear a bit of, you hear some evidence about a sting happening. But that's because half the time we don't hear anything about how any of it's being done. So it is used in Europe, maybe not to the same extent. There is a sort of culture of that type of policing in the United States. It goes beyond counterterrorism. They do it with vice, drugs, prostitution is very common, the sting operation. They've just applied it to terrorism as well. Overall, I'd say very, very effectively.
Okay, so the final bit I want to touch on, then I'll go to some of the questions, is, again, you've got a section in the book looking at preachers, and one of those, obviously, ICSR and myself know quite well, having identified him several years ago as a highly influential character within the English-speaking sort of ISIS supporting community online, which is Ahmed Musa Jibril, who is resident in Michigan, has a sort of interesting history, having previously been in jail in Terre Haute, and mixing with people like John Walker Lind, the famous American Taliban member, of course, who was arrested and taken back to the United States shortly after 9/11 and so on. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what you discovered about Ahmed Musa Jibril since we first brought him to light, but also if there were other people that you were seeing as well as sort of influential preachers in that context.
Yeah, so one of the last chapters is called the ideologues, and it's kind of, we try to break down the book as far as the kind of the different sort of faces of the presence of ISIS in the United States. And the ideologues are important because they provide that connection that's much harder to have, that I mentioned, right? The actual connection to legitimate or seemingly legitimate figures and leadership figures, or people with some kind of charisma and legitimacy to make someone feel as if they're connected to this movement. A connection that's harder to feel in the United States because of what I've mentioned before. So they play a very important role in that way, as guides, as connections. Ahmed Musa Jibril, I think, actually was, as we know in the book, I think pretty much first ever mentioned, came on the radar in the ISIS context with your work at ICSR on people who were influencing Brits and Europeans to join ISIS. They were very regularly connected to his talks and his social media presence. But the thing with him, even in the research that ICSR has done, and even ours, is not a single actual connection to any ISIS recruitment, anything. No, he's never actually broken the law as far as terrorism goes, right? Which is something that's actually we should keep in mind in terms of how effective these ideologues can be. They don't need to really, especially in the US with the freedom of speech statutes they have there, you can get a lot done in terms of recruiting for a jihadist group, promoting its ideas without breaking the law, without in terms of at least terrorism. So you mentioned Ahmed Musa Jibril had been in prison. He was in prison for fraud for many years, not for anything to do with terrorism-related activity. So they can still very effectively get the message across. Now, why he's effective is one of the things that we did when we researched him was actually he'd been a presence in the US in the 90s. He was actually probably one of the first American preachers to be praising Al-Qaeda pre-9/11 in the United States. So he was praising the embassy bombings, the Al-Qaeda embassy bombings in East Africa on a blog he had in the US. And he was also very closely connected with members of the Sahwa movement, interestingly. So he was a big fan of a number of those key players. Salman al-Auda was a family friend of his, in fact, stayed with him in the United States. So we had this connection both to sort of jihadist thinkers, but also kind of activist Salafi Sahwa figures. And had been praising, Al-Qaeda activism right up until 9/11 in the US, and had a pretty strong local presence. He was a known local preacher. He was speaking at the universities. He was carrying out halakas, religious discussions at home. He was kind of a community leader in Michigan, and established himself as such, and then used all that to kind of create a sort of image of himself as an Islamic preacher, a very hardline Salafi one with a sympathy for Al-Qaeda. After 9/11, he's obviously doesn't continue open support for AQ, but the blog is, you can still find his blog online if you know how to dig around for it. He never, recanted any of that. So actually, we're talking about a guy that was an Al-Qaeda supporter in the late 90s. So it's not a total coincidence that he reemerges later on, actually. So it's interesting to know those past influences, connections of his. But again, as I said, went to prison, nothing to do with terrorism. Comes out pretty much around the time that IS emerges, and very big YouTube presence, a big social media presence at a time. That's all gone now largely, but the vast majority of his lectures are issues of theology, issues of fiqh, issues of Salafi, sort of religious discussion. Actually, very little comes down to specific. Almost never does he mention ISIS, but he mentions the situation in Syria. He talks about the suffering that's taking place, and he essentially tries to shame his audience into acting. Essentially saying, "Look what they're doing to the honor of our women. Look what these Shia, animals, as he would put it, are up to." Very sectarian, very anti-Shia, and very effective at kind of saying you should join ISIS without actually specifically saying it, and also discussing all the ideological stuff around it. So justifying all the key doctrines. Establishing an Islamic State being a duty. So Hakimiyya and all the other stuff. So setting it all up very effectively, and clearly got this, touched a nerve, and had the charisma, had the apparent scholarship. He's not he's a trained scholar. But again, as I said, like a lot of these other preachers, did it without mentioning ISIS directly. But probably so he was among the most popular. He's the kind of go-to ideologue for wider kind of doctrinal stuff. But beyond him, probably the most active is another name that many of those who've been watching this for a long time will know about. It's Abdullah Al-Faisal, Jamaican-born Salafi jihadist cleric, lived in the UK, lived around Africa, and he went back to his homeland, Jamaica, after causing all sorts of problems in Europe, being a major Al-Qaeda preacher and a recruiter for many years. Went back to Jamaica and continued preaching in support of jihadism. When ISIS emerges, he's hugely, fulsome in his praise, openly praising ISIS specifically, being much more direct. And we've shown in the book, not only does he provide, of course, the ideological cover, but for his network, fairly large network of supporters online, he actually acted as a connection and as a sort of someone who was who would vouch for his members who wanted to join ISIS. He was connecting them with members of ISIS in Syria, helping them connect, even overseeing marriages for female members who wanted to kind of go there as married women or get married there. He was acting as the go-between, even for that, the marriage rights. So having a much more, he can be connected to actual cases where he's spoken to members, helped them develop plots to go and join or commit attacks, and is facing charges now in the United States on that basis. He will end up eventually spending probably the rest of his life in a US prison somewhere, but he has really managed to, survive. It's amazing we're still talking about Abdullah al-Faisal in 2020. We were talking about him in 2005, even before, right? And he still managed to weathered it, and still he comes up. And he's probably the most operational, I would say, or was.
And I mean, for people logging in, I mean, he was in jail, if I'm not mistaken, prior to the 7/7 attacks, actually on something else, but was then deported to Jamaica as a result of the post 7/7 roundup, really, in the UK, where a number of key preachers, so Omar Bakri left the country and was refused entry back here. Faisal was removed. Abu Hamza was sent to the US. And so there was like a slow churn post 7/7 in the UK of kicking out some of these high profile clerics who had been here causing trouble. The one who took the longest to expel, of course, being Abu Qatada, who was eventually sent back to Jordan. And stuff. So look, we've got a few questions, probably don't have time for all of them, but I'll start with one I think is probably most relevant at this point. It says, would you say that it's true the concept of attacking the far enemy is alive and well, because it means this can be achieved domestically and easily through citizens already in the country?
Yes. So, we may have, you've argued about sort of ISIS refocusing on the near enemy, and I would say probably, strategically, that's what its focus absolutely is, in order for it to survive and continue doing what it's been trying to do over these years. But that's not to say that it's not opportunistic. And as I mentioned before, if the opportunities are there to carry out attacks in the United States, they're not going to say no. They're not a group that's afraid of the attention it's going to reach. It's got nothing to lose, right? If it backs a major attack in the United States, how's that going to change the amount of targeting that is already done on the group by US and other allied forces? It's not really, it has nothing to lose, huge amounts to gain, obviously. With even, we see the impact that even the most minor attacks continue to have, psychologically on us, politically, in terms of maintaining a presence for the group, and giving sort of motivation and hope to possible recruits that it's still possible. So yes, the opportunity is there in the sense that there are plenty of ISIS sympathizers in the United States today, who, with the right connection, with the right things coming together, will plan an attack, and it's most likely now to be something that is pretty much self-generated. There was a period when a number of largely British ISIS members in Syria, Junaid Hussain, most well known, oversaw, using Telegram and other encrypted media, directed and oversaw planned attacks in the US. So kind of gave them a bit more of a professional veneer, or kind of gave them a bit more direction. But most of them are now dead, what we call the virtual entrepreneurs, the people who are directing attacks from abroad. So we're probably likely to see kind of fairly low level, but it'll continue happening. Yes, absolutely. If the opportunity is there, they will take it for a near enemy attack, no doubt.
All right, so I'm going to take one more question just so we can end relatively on time. Actually, there's one more just come through in the last moment. Let me see. How have ISIS elements in the US reacted to ISIS defeats in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere? Does it diminish their ability to organize attacks in the US, and do followers start to look to other groups for support? So actually, we'll take that one as the last one. And then I know there are some other questions as well. Apologies if we haven't been able to get to those, but I think that's a good one to end on.
Sure. So I suppose it depends what elements. So actually some very interesting work done by a former colleague of mine and former student of ours, in fact, Audrey Alexander, who's now at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. She was a colleague of ours at the Program on Extremism and helped us a lot with our research. In particular, she developed a brilliant way to mine and store ISIS supporters, American ISIS supporters, social media activity. And she did notice that as she'd noticed changes in social media activity based on defeats and attacks, and generally, actually what you would largely expect, which is a lot of attention around a certain moment, but then attempts to kind of, if it is a negative outcome for ISIS on the battlefield, attempts to shift attention away. But overall, it doesn't. The main thing that has affected, as I mentioned, I think, was as ISIS territory and as ISIS kind of stop being a state entity, they absolutely have refocused their efforts for their supporters abroad in the U.S. to really continue to stay there and conduct whatever kind of support operations they can, if not attacks, fundraising, propaganda creation. And so we've seen all sorts of sort of innovative things happen in response, where they have, because they're not able to travel there, they're told to do other things. There's an IT expert who developed an AI to automate the spread and storage of ISIS propaganda on Telegram. So he kind of basically created a way to completely automate that system. So it meant much harder for an already difficult process on Telegram to get this stuff down. He kind of used all his IT skills to develop this sort of AI software to do that. Other people, use their expertise on sort of the on Bitcoin and other sort of dark corners of the web, particularly when it comes to fundraising, to use that money to help fund ISIS, and sort of all sort of kind of other innovations that we've seen because of the fact that they can't really travel. And I think what we can expect is that to continue, to people to continue to respond to this, to the changing situation with, innovative ways to maintain some kind of activity and presence.
Great. Well, look, Al, thanks very much for taking us through all the various components of this book. I know it's an important contribution to literature, particularly as so many people sort of studying ISIS, and there have been a number of studies already. This provides a very targeted focus on ISIS in an important environment, of course, the way it's operating in the United States. So I encourage everyone to go out and, of course, to buy that book. I'll also just say, seeing as we've been discussing the US context a lot tonight in this context as well, BBC Panorama this evening at 9 p.m. has a program about a child from ISIS who was taken to ISIS territory by his mother, who was eventually repatriated, is now living with his father in the US, and his mother's in jail. But it's sort of charting that boy's journey over the last few years. And I think this should be a really good and interesting piece of TV. I've been in touch with the producers for it for a while now, so they have treated this subject very, very delicately. And I think a lot of the issues that we've been speaking about tonight, and this book will look at, will come through in that show this evening. So that might be of interest to people who have logged in. Of course, all it remains to say is do make sure you go out and get a copy of the book. I don't know if there's any promotional things, Hitch, to say.
Backwards. It's just like a mirror. You're seeing a mirror image, I guess, backwards, like seeing ambulance. So, but you're getting the gist of it at least.
Exactly. Great. Well, thank you all very much. And yeah, thanks to you, Hitch.
Thank you. Thanks very much, ICSR, Shiraz, everyone who came on. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.